The first snow of winter in 1515 lay over the Bulgarian village of Koprastit like a burial shroud. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, sensing strangers on the road. Before the villagers could even glimpse them, the sound of horses' hooves broke the fragile silence, measured and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock that counted down to disaster. They did not come like raiders, no torches, no drawn swords. Instead, they arrived with leather-bound ledgers pressed under their arms, parchment rolls tucked into satchels, and the insignia of the Sultan stitched in careful gold thread across their coats. Government men, official men, men whose power lay not in steel, but in ink. The villagers had seen soldiers before ragged mercenaries or swaggering Ottoman cavalry, but these officials were something different. They carried no air of chaos, only the precision of an accountant balancing his books. When they dismounted, they did not speak to the gathered crowd. They walked past them, straight toward the home of a blacksmith named Dimitrov, as if they had lived here all their lives. Inside the ledger, the name of his son was already written: Marko Dimitrov, age 7, son of a blacksmith, healthy, dark hair, brown eyes, strong build. The entry had been made months before, somewhere in Constantinople, in a room far removed from this cold village. A bureaucrat had reduced a boy's life to a few descriptive lines and a number in the margin. Marco's mother clutched her son so tightly his ribs ached. She could feel his small heart hammering beneath her fingers. And in that moment, she knew the officials had not come to speak, negotiate, or explain. They had come to collect. The process was chilling in its efficiency. No shouting, no searching. They opened the ledger, drew a neat line through Marco's name, and nodded to the man holding the horse's reins. It was the same gesture a delivery clerk might use when confirming the pickup of a parcel. Marco cried out for his mother, and her voice followed him down the frozen road, breaking into the kind of scream that seems to tear the human soul in half. This was not random cruelty. This was the Devshirme, the child collection system that would feed the Ottoman Empire's military and palaces for centuries, to the people who enforced it. It was not a crime, but a duty. To the families who endured it, it was the day their world split open. But here is the truth most histories avoid. The Ottoman Empire's most horrifying machine began not in a battlefield or a dungeon, but in an office, a warm room in Constantinople where ink stained the fingers of quiet clerks, and the sound of quills scratching paper spelled doom for children hundreds of miles away. This was empire by mathematics, conquest by calculation, and for the boys whose names filled those ledgers, the beginning of a life they would never choose and never escape. From the outside, the Devshirme might have looked like a crude form of kidnapping, but to the Ottoman state, it was a perfected mechanism, a bureaucratic marvel that could transform the unpredictable violence of conquest into something orderly, predictable, and profitable. It worked like this. Every Christian village within certain Ottoman provinces was assigned a quota. The number wasn't guessed at, nor left to the whim of the collectors. It was calculated coldly and deliberately by statisticians who knew the population size, past collection rates, and the empire's current needs for soldiers, servants, or other uses. A ledger page didn't just list names, it listed inventory. The criteria were equally precise. Boys had to be between 7 and 20. Though the most desired were under 10, they must be strong enough to endure the brutal training, free from visible disabilities, and, ideally, from regions already proven to produce quality stock. Albanians were valued for loyalty, Bosnians for height, Greeks for quickness of mind. The empire had its own handbook of stereotypes, and it wielded them like a measuring stick against living children. When the collectors arrived, they moved with a merchant's detachment. A boy's teeth would be checked as though he were a horse, his limbs pressed and flexed for hidden weaknesses. The French diplomat, Jean-Baptiste Tavan, who witnessed such a selection in 1631, wrote with quiet horror, "They handle the boys as our merchants handle horses." The comparison wasn't poetic, it was literal. In the Ottoman archives, the record for the 1515 collection lists Koprastit owing 23 boys, Panagarishta 31, Pazaragic 47. These figures were not arbitrary. They were the output of a system where human futures were balanced like columns of grain or gold. If a village fell short, the collectors would take extra from elsewhere, ensuring the imperial totals remained untouched. What modern minds might see as cruelty, the empire saw as quality control. Children were examined, sorted, and earmarked for roles they would not learn about until long after their old lives had been erased. Even the act of taking them was wrapped in the language of administration, fulfilling quotas, meeting collection targets. And for the officials who inked the ledgers, there was no moral weight to their work. They were civil servants, not raiders. They followed rules, deadlines, and instructions. But their pens could dismantle a family as surely as any sword. And in the cold logic of empire, that was not a tragedy, it was policy. In the brittle pages of the Constantinople archives, Marco Dimitroff's entry sits among hundreds of others from that winter of 1515. His name is followed by the neat, looping script of an imperial clerk, healthy, strong shoulders, good posture, likely to endure training. It is the sort of description you might expect for a prize animal, not a boy who still counted the seasons by the taste of the first spring cherries. When the collectors came for Marco, they didn't wander the village asking questions. They went straight to his home. They knew his father's name, his trade, even the number of oxen in his pen. It was as if an invisible hand had drawn a line from their office in Constantinople directly to his front door. His father, a blacksmith, tried to stand in the threshold, broad arms blocking the doorway. But resistance had its limits, and Ottoman officials' patience even more so. A glance from the head collector was enough to have soldiers step forward. The blacksmith's wife gripped her son, trembling so hard that her teeth chattered. The ledger was opened, Marco's name crossed with a firm stroke, and the boy was led away without another word. And Marco was not the only one. That week, in a nearby village, a boy named Pitar was taken from the church steps where he had been helping light candles for the Sunday Mass. In another, a farmer's son named Georgios was led away mid-meal, the steam still rising from his wooden bowl of cabbage stew, the pattern repeated with such precision that it seemed choreographed. For the collectors, these were not tragedies, they were successes. Each crossed-out name meant another number toward the quota. Each boy taken meant the empire's needs for that season were closer to being met. The Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste Tavan's account still lingers in the mind the way the collectors bent down, tilting a child's chin, pressing on his teeth, running calloused hands along his arms and legs. Tavan noted the indifference in their eyes. As our merchants handle horses, a phrase that would echo in European reports for decades. It was not the violence that made the scene monstrous, but its civility. The collectors bowed politely to elders, thanked village leaders for their cooperation, and then turned to lead the chosen boys away. By the time the officials remounted their horses, the streets were silent except for the low sobs of women behind shuttered windows. And somewhere, in the leather-bound ledger resting in the collector's satchel, the ink dried over a crossed-out name. For years, the quotas came like the seasons, predictable, dreaded, and unstoppable. But in 1522, something in the Balkans broke. The Ottoman court, hungry for more recruits, had raised the quotas by 40%. Villages that once lost 20 boys were now ordered to surrender 28 in Ujit, a small Serbian town tucked between steep hills and frozen rivers. The demand was beyond endurance: 67 boys, including several who were only 6 years old. The order was delivered by a scribe with the same flat voice one might use to recite tax figures. He read from the imperial decree as if its words weighed nothing, but to the families who listened, each number landed like a hammer blow. The rebellion began before dawn. Church bells rang out, not in celebration, but in alarm. Men armed with farming tools, hunting spears, and the occasional rusted sword filled the narrow streets. Mothers ushered children into cellars, whispering hurried prayers. When the collectors arrived under the fluttering green and gold banners of the Sultan, they found the town gates barred. The clash was brief but merciless. Ottoman troops, better armed and disciplined, cut through the defenders with mechanical precision. By midday, Ujit was burning. 3,000 lay dead: fathers, brothers, sons. The survivors were left to bury their dead under the watch of the same officials who had come for their children that morning. And yet, the rebellion's aftermath revealed something even more chilling than its brutality. The empire did not waver. The quotas remained. The only change was administrative. Collection records were updated to include more precise population estimates, and village reports were to be filed earlier, to avoid what the scribes blandly called inventory disputes. Resistance, it turned out, did not make the empire question its morality. It made the empire refine its methods. From the imperial perspective, the uprising was not a warning to end the Devshirme system. It was an inconvenience to be solved. And so, with new record-keeping protocols in place, the child collections continued, the ledgers swelling with names that would never see home again. Between 1450 and 1650, the Devshirme system reached its cruel perfection. Historians estimate that, in those 2 centuries alone, between 200,000 and 500,000 Christian boys vanished into the Ottoman machine. On average, 2,500 children each year every year were taken from their homes, their names crossed out in ledgers and replaced by numbers in military rosters or palace inventories. Imagine a government census not for tax deductions or school enrollment, but to schedule the removal of your children. Picture officials arriving with neatly ruled lists, the name of your son, the date he will be taken, and the purpose he will serve for the empire. There is no trial, no appeal, no uncertainty, only the knowledge that when the day comes, the knock on your door will not be refused. The empire cloaked this cruelty in religious legitimacy. Sultan Murad II's chief Islamic judge issued a fatwa in 1432 declaring the practice not just legal, but virtuous and act of salvation for infidel children, who would be converted to Islam and taught the true faith. For the scholars who wrote these rulings, the conversion was an act of mercy. For the parents who watched their children disappear into the horizon, it was a hollow, poisoned gift. Behind the moral language, the Devshirme was driven by pragmatism. The empire needed soldiers, the elite Janissaries, who guarded the sultan and fought his wars, and it needed loyal servants in its palaces, treasuries, and administrative offices. The child levy provided both. Over time, the process became more specialized, with certain boys groomed for military brilliance, others for political cunning, and still others for skills that required absolute obedience. The most chilling detail: these were not crimes committed in secret alleys or behind locked doors. They were carried out in the open, under the seal of the Sultan, recorded with the same bureaucratic precision as grain shipments or tax collections. The numbers were not abstract to those who lived them. They were counted in empty chairs at the family table, in the silences left behind where a child's laughter had once been, and for every name inked into the ledgers of Constantinople, a village somewhere carried the weight of that absence year after year, generation after generation. By the mid-1500s, the Devshirme had evolved beyond a simple levy for the Janissary corps. The Ottoman state had learned to sort its human spoils with the precision of a jeweler examining gems, assigning each boy to the role that would yield the greatest return for the empire. The strongest, most physically imposing were sent to the Janissaries, the elite infantry who could march for weeks, fight in tight formation, and stand unflinching before cannon fire. The quick-minded, those who showed early signs of sharp memory or cunning, were marked for palace service to learn the intricacies of Ottoman court politics, treasury management, and the delicate art of serving the Sultan himself. Others, chosen for their grace, voice, or beauty, were sent down far more dangerous and intimate paths. Even ethnicity became a category in this human ledger. Albanian boys were prized for their supposed loyalty, Bosnians for height and stamina, Greeks for intellect, Armenians for their careful, deliberate nature. These judgments were codified into the selection process, as though human character could be distilled into racial traits, stamped into flesh like a merchant's mark. The rules, on paper, contained loopholes or so, parents thought. Married boys were supposedly exempt, prompting desperate families to arrange unions for sons barely into adolescence. But by 1540, those protections had dissolved. Married boys were taken anyway, sometimes as young as 12, leaving behind child brides widowed before their womanhood had even begun. Some parents tried to buy their way out. The price to save a son was fixed in grim arithmetic 50 gold coins, the equivalent of 5 years of a peasant family's earnings. Those who scraped together the sum often found the bribes useless. If the quota demanded their child, the money merely changed hands before the boy was taken all the same. It was in this period that the Devshirme began to look less like a levy and more like an early form of industrial resource allocation. The empire had built a classification system that could rival any merchant guild only instead of fabrics, spices, or metals. The commodity was human life. Some grief is too large for words, and so it becomes song. Across the Balkans, women poured their sorrow into melodies that wove memory and mourning into something that could be carried on the wind long after their sons were gone. One of the most haunting came from Serbia. 9 sons I bore, 9 sons I raised, 9 sons the Turks have taken. Now I birth only tears, I nurse only sorrow. My womb is a grave, my breasts give poison. This was no metaphor for those who sang it. These were the voices of women who had watched each child taken in turn, until their homes echoed with a silence more terrible than any wailing in some villages. The women refused to plant flowers near their doorsteps. They could not bear the thought of beauty growing where their sons had been stolen. Folk songs became a kind of resistance, a way to name the crime when naming it aloud could bring punishment. They told stories of boys hiding in church lofts, of mothers bargaining with gold and heirlooms, of sisters cutting their hair to disguise brothers from the collectors. The Ottomans could take the sons, but they could not stop the voices that carried their names. Yet, the songs were also wounds. Every performance reopened the loss, each note pulling fresh blood from a heart that had never healed. Older women would hum them while spinning wool, and the younger ones, even those who had never seen a collection, would learn the words before they learned to read. In the fields, the refrain would rise above the sound of the scythe, mingling with the cry of crows. It was not defiance in the way a sword is defiance. It was something quieter and, perhaps, more enduring, a refusal to forget. For the mothers, the greatest terror was not the moment the boy was taken, though that was horror enough, but the knowing that somewhere their son still lived, yet could not return, a living absence, breathing in a foreign tongue, wearing the Sultan's colors. And so they sang, for their sons, for themselves, for the memory of a time before the ledger came to their door. The nightmare of the Devshirme did not end when the boy was led away from his home. In truth, that was only the beginning. The true cruelty began on the road, in the carts and caravans that carried them toward the empire's training centers and toward the slow, deliberate death of who they had been. The first rule was silence. Boys were forbidden to speak in their native languages, watched by guards who understood enough to catch a slip. Those caught whispering in Serbian, Greek, or Albanian were struck, made to repeat phrases in Ottoman Turkish until the foreign sounds lodged in their mouths. Even their names were stripped away within days. Alexandros became Ahmed, Nikola became Mehmed. The old names were not merely forbidden, they were erased. Records from the Enderun school, the empire's elite training institution, describe this process in unnerving detail. A 10-year-old Greek boy, Alexandros, arrived in 1543, in week 1. The log notes. Still responds to birth name, correction applied. By week 4. No longer responds to original name. By the 12th week, recites Turkish prayers without hesitation. By month 6, the boy who had stepped off the cart had been dissolved into someone else entirely. This was not a clumsy breaking of spirit, it was calculated reprogramming. The boys were shaved, clothed in identical rough wool garments, their diets regulated to the same meals at the same times. They slept in rows on hard mats, woke at the same call, moved together through corridors designed to be so uniform that no corner could anchor a memory of home. In one particularly telling case from 1547, guards at the Galata training facility discovered 50 boys conversing in Serbian during rest. The punishment was not just beatings. Each boy was forced to stand before his peers and denounce his homeland, to declare in Turkish that he renounced his former life. 3 who refused were placed in prolonged isolation. When they emerged, Witnesses said they struggled to speak any language at all. The Ottomans called it discipline. Modern minds would call it the destruction of identity. But within the empire, it was simply part of the process, the first step in making a child not a son, not a Christian, not even himself, but an instrument of the Sultan's will. The Ottomans did not rely on improvisation to transform their captives. They had a manual, the Kanun-i Istanbul, a document as methodical as it was merciless laid out, in numbered chapters, how to break a boy's ties to his past and build him anew as a servant of the Sultan. Chapter 3 carried a title that still chills, On Creating New Men. Its instructions read like a craftsman's guide. Only the material was human. The child must be made to understand that his life before was incomplete. It declared, memories of family and homeland are to be replaced with loyalty to the Sultan. When the child embraces his new identity fully, the transformation is complete. That transformation began with the body. Hair was cut in the same severe style for all recruits. The rough wool uniforms itched constantly, discouraging idle comfort. Meals were identical, portions measured to the mouthful. Every movement, from walking to sitting, was dictated by rule. Boys were forbidden from choosing their own posture, their own gestures, anything that might carry a trace of individuality. The architecture of the training centers enforced this sameness. Long corridors without decoration, communal sleeping halls without privacy, no windows looking out onto familiar landscapes. The spaces were designed to be alien, disorienting places where no corner could feel like home. Psychological conditioning was built into the smallest details. The daily schedule was relentless prayers at set hours, drills between lessons, meals punctuated by silence. If a boy hesitated in his duties or stumbled over Turkish phrases, older recruits were instructed to correct him, not with cruelty for its own sake, but with calculated humiliation. The aim was to make the boy crave conformity, to seek approval not as an individual, but as part of a unit. By the time months had passed, the uniformity was total. 50 boys would stand in a row, indistinguishable in voice, dress, and manner. No one laughed differently, no one walked differently. Each had been filed down to fit the mold, a perfect interchangeable part in the Sultan's machine. It was here, in these corridors of erasure, that the Ottoman Empire perfected what modern psychology might call identity reformation, but to the boys who endured it, there was no such term, only the slow vanishing of the child they once were. Once a boy's memories had been stripped away, the Ottomans set about giving him a new family, one that began and ended with the Sultan. The training schools were divided into small groups, each led by an older recruit who acted as an elder brother, and supervised by an officer who served as the father. These bonds were not optional. They were enforced with the same precision as military drills, carefully crafted to replace the ties severed back in the boy's village. Privileges became the currency of loyalty. The boy who mastered Turkish fastest might receive an extra piece of bread at supper. The one who excelled in reciting Islamic prayers could earn a wool blanket against the winter cold. Warmth, food, comfort. The most basic human needs were doled out in direct proportion to how quickly a child abandoned his past. Hasan Pasha, once a Christian boy taken through the Devshirme, left a memoir that makes the system's cruelty plain. I learned to forget the child I had been, he wrote, for those memories brought only confusion and pain. The Sultan became my father. My companions became my brothers. The rest ceased to exist. The facilities themselves were designed to crush any lingering connection to the outside world. Boys were rotated between schools without warning, so they could never grow too attached to a location, religious icons, familiar foods. Even the view from a window that might reveal a known landscape, all were forbidden. And still, there was competition. The system made sure of it. Those who adapted slowly risked punishment or reassignment to harsher duties. Those who adapted quickly were rewarded, and in doing so, they became models for the others, proof that the only path to survival was total surrender. By the time a boy emerged from this phase of training, his loyalty to the Sultan was not merely obedience, it was dependence, ingrained through hunger, cold, and the constant need for approval. Whatever ties he had once felt to his parents, his language, his God, those had been starved out of him. In their place was something the Ottomans valued far more, a willing tool who could no longer imagine belonging anywhere else. When the months of grinding indoctrination were over, the boys who remained were no longer simply captives, they were products, polished and prepared for the empire's use. The transformation was so complete that to an outsider, these young men seemed like Ottomans born. A French observer in 1605 wrote with an almost reluctant awe, "To speak with a Janissary who was born Christian is to converse with a man who has no past. The boy who existed before exists no longer. In his place stands an Ottoman creation, complete in loyalty because he has no other identity to return to." But not all survived to reach this stage. The Ottoman records were brutally honest about attrition. Mortality rates were accepted as part of the system, calculated into the quotas from the very beginning. In a given year, thousands might be processed, but hundreds would die from disease, exhaustion, or the procedures meant to prepare them for certain roles. Death was not considered a failure, only an adjustment in the supply line. Those who endured faced diverging fates. Some would be assigned to the Janissary Corps. Their training focused on military discipline, weapon mastery, and absolute obedience. Others would serve within the palace walls as pages, treasury clerks, or attendants to high-ranking officials. Still others those marked for physical beauty. Voice or talent would be placed in paths that blurred the line between service and entertainment. By the time they left the training facilities, these young men could no longer imagine walking back into the villages from which they had been taken, even if they escaped. Their language had rusted on their tongues, their prayers belonged to a different faith, their posture, their speech, their very way of existing marked them as something other than what they had been born. For the empire, this was the success of the Devshirme, not just to take a child, but to make it impossible for that child ever to go home. Graduation from the training schools was not the end of the process. It was the moment the empire decided how best to use the human tools it had forged. This was not done haphazardly. The Ottomans had developed a sorting system that mirrored the precision of a merchant cataloging valuable cargo. The strongest and most disciplined went to the Janissary Corps, where their loyalty would be tested on the battlefield. Those with quick minds and the ability to read, calculate, and memorize were steered toward administrative duties. Palace clerks, treasury assistants, or aides to provincial governors. The most obedient and physically presentable were directed into palace service, where discretion was valued as highly as strength, and for a select few, whose beauty, grace, or musical skill stood out. Another path was chosen, one that would lead into the empire's entertainment culture. The decisions were made after a series of assessments that combined physical inspection, skill demonstration, and even personality evaluation. A boy's height might determine his suitability for ceremonial guard duty. His handwriting could decide whether he'd spend his life buried in ledgers. Everything was measured against the empire's needs and the boy's perceived value. Ethnic origin still played a role in these placements. Albanians, believed to be unshakably loyal, often found themselves in sensitive palace positions. Bosnians, known for their stature and endurance, were directed toward military service. Greeks, praised for their intellect, were funneled into administrative or scholarly roles. These stereotypes, written into Ottoman practice, shaped the destinies of thousands without a word of their own consent. From a distance, it might have looked like an early form of career guidance, but the reality was closer to the sorting of livestock at a market. Human lives were being assigned a function in the imperial machine, and every choice was made with one guiding principle: maximum utility to the Sultan. For those who had survived the years of identity erasure, the sorting was not a liberation. It was simply the next stage in a life that had been planned for them since the moment their name was inked into the ledger. Even the timing of the Devshirme was engineered for efficiency. Collections most often took place in spring, when roads were passable and rivers calmer, making transport to the empire's centers smoother. It also meant the boys could be integrated into training cycles that aligned with the agricultural calendar and the timing of military campaigns. The empire's war machine, its economy, and its child levy system were all locked together like gears. Training facilities did not operate in isolation. They formed a network, strategically placed across the empire, major hubs in Constantinople, Anatolia, and the Balkans. Smaller intake stations fed into these centers, moving the boys along like goods in a supply chain. Caravans brought new recruits from rural villages to regional depots, and from there, they were funneled into specialized schools or military academies depending on their assigned role. The infrastructure to sustain this system was immense. Dormitories housed hundreds under one roof. Classrooms were devoted to language instruction, religious study, military drill. Kitchens fed thousands of mouths each day, while medical stations patched up injuries not out of kindness. But to keep the human machinery running, even the design of these facilities served a purpose: long rows of beds to enforce uniformity, high walls to block escape, corridors that bent and doubled back so no boy could easily map the place in his mind. Transport routes were carefully planned. River barges, coastal ships, and guarded overland convoys ensured the boys could be moved swiftly and securely. The same roads that carried grain, tax revenues, and imperial decrees carried human cargo. Every link in the chain was maintained with the precision of a merchant guarding his most profitable trade. To the Ottomans, this was not cruelty, it was administration. The child levy was simply another seasonal task, like collecting harvests or preparing troops for a campaign, but for the families in its path. Each spring was a season of dread, the time when every hoofbeat on the road might signal the loss of another son. For some boys, survival in the Devshirme system did not lead to the battlefield or the Sultan's court, but to the polished floors and candlelit rooms of Constantinople's entertainment houses. This was the world of the köçek young male dancers whose careers began in the same ledgers and collection quotas as soldiers and clerks. It started with selection. During training, overseers watched for grace of movement, rhythm, and an ease before an audience. A boy who could move fluidly during drills, or who kept perfect time during ceremonial marches, might be quietly marked for special instruction. From there, his path diverged sharply from his fellow recruits. The köçek schools were as structured as the military academies. Dance masters drilled the boys in elaborate steps, spins, and gestures. Each movement meant to be both precise and alluring. Music lessons taught them to keep time with drums, lutes, and flutes, while poetry and storytelling polished their ability to charm an audience. The costumes, silk sashes, embroidered vests. Flowing trousers were chosen to catch the light as the dancer moved. By the mid-1600s, this art form had become an established cultural institution in the Ottoman capital. In certain quarters near the Grand Bazaar, wealthy patrons gathered in ornate halls for evenings of performance. The most skilled köçeks could make a crowd erupt in applause or fall into hushed awe, earning coins thrown at their feet and invitations to perform privately for high-ranking officials. But behind the applause was the same machinery of exploitation. The köçeks rarely kept the money they earned. Most went to their trainers or the owners of the entertainment houses. Their schedules were grueling rehearsals by day, performances deep into the night, constant travel between venues. For some, their fame offered protection. For others, it brought unwanted attention from powerful men whose interest went beyond dance. The 1650 riot at Sultanahmet revealed just how volatile this world could be. Two Ottoman officials, vying for the favor of a particularly gifted dancer named Yaha, came to blows in the middle of a performance. The brawl spilled into the street, their entourages joining in, and by dawn, 12 people were dead and part of the market district lay in ashes. The empire's response was not to question the köçek tradition, but to regulate it. Guild rules were revised to manage competition among patrons, ensuring the performances could continue without disrupting the city's order. For the boys drawn into this world, it was another kind of captivity, gilded and applauded, but captivity nonetheless. By the late 17th century, the köçek tradition was more than just a pastime for Ottoman elites. It had become a thriving industry, with its own guild system, apprenticeship programs, and performance circuits stretching from Istanbul to provincial cities. The Istanbul Entertainment Guild, established in 1577, regulated every aspect of the profession: training standards, acceptable costumes, music styles, even retirement provisions for dancers who aged out of the craft. The economics were staggering. A top performer could command fees of 50 gold dinars for a single evening, more than a skilled craftsman might earn in an entire year. Yet the vast majority of that money never touched the dancers' hands. Trainers, managers, and venue owners absorbed the profits, leaving the boys dependent on the same system that had plucked them from their villages years before. Patronage played a central role. Wealthy merchants, military officers, and even members of the imperial court would sponsor a promising young performer, covering his expenses in exchange for exclusive performances. Such arrangements could last years, sometimes propelling a köçek into near celebrity status. The most famous names were immortalized in poems and songs, their movements compared to the grace of falcons or the flow of the Bosphorus. Public performances followed elaborate protocols. A köçek might enter the room to the rhythm of a small drum, circling the audience before launching into a series of precise spins and intricate footwork. Every gesture was rehearsed to perfection. Every turn calculated to catch the shimmer of embroidered fabric. Coins and small gifts rained down, each one a token of admiration or possession. But the life was not without its shadows: the constant scrutiny, the rivalries between dancers, the pressure to maintain perfection, all took their toll. Behind the glitter of the stage lay exhaustion, injuries, and the quiet knowledge that their youth was the source of their value. The day they aged beyond it, the audience would move on. In the guild halls, younger apprentices watched the veterans with a mix of admiration and fear. They understood that the same applause that elevated a dancer to fame could vanish in a single season, replaced by fresher faces already in training. For the Ottoman elite, the köçek was an ornament of culture for the boys themselves. It was another form of servitude that demanded their bodies, their grace, and their submission. If the köçek tradition represented one branch of Ottoman exploitation, the empire's enslavement of women was its vast, sprawling trunk. In Constantinople, slavery was not hidden in shadows, it stood in the open, in markets sanctioned by the state, taxed by imperial officials, and guarded by law. At its height, the city held an estimated 300,000 enslaved women at any given time, with thousands more passing through its markets each month. The Suleymaniye commercial complex kept meticulous records on ordinary days. Between 200 and 300 women sold, on special market days, as many as 1,000. The numbers were so large that the slave markets rivaled the city's grain bazaars in both activity and profit. Prices were not arbitrary. They were codified in lists that read like inventories of goods age, origin, physical features, and perceived skills, all factored into the value. Circassians and Georgians fetched the highest sums, prized for their pale skin and features that the Ottoman elite romanticized. African women were often sold for hard labor, their prices reflecting brutal prejudices. The markets functioned with an efficiency that erased any pretense of humanity. Beyond the market stalls, there were training compounds, institutional facilities designed to prepare enslaved women for their assigned roles. Here they were taught Turkish, Ottoman court etiquette, music, and dance. Household management was drilled into them alongside lessons in serving at table or arranging clothing for a lady of rank. The compounds operated with the same rigid schedules and hierarchical discipline as the Devshirme schools for boys. The most famous example of this system's reach is Roxolana, born Anastasia, or Alexandra Lasavska, in what is now Ukraine, captured in a Tatar raid. She was sold in Constantinople and eventually entered the Sultan's palace. History often romanticizes her as the powerful consort of Suleiman the Magnificent. But her story began in the same slave pens as thousands of other girls, each facing a lifetime dictated by the Sultan's will. The source regions for enslaved women were mapped as carefully as any trade route, from the Black Sea coast, Circassians and Georgians from the Balkans, Greeks and Slavs from Africa. Women brought through Mediterranean and Red Sea ports. These flows fed Constantinople's demand like rivers pouring into an ocean. In the heart of the capital, the market squares rang with the calls of auctioneers, the clink of coins, and the rustle of fabric as buyers inspected potential purchases. For the empire, it was commerce. For the women who stood under the appraising gaze of strangers, it was the moment their lives split in two before and after the sale. Once purchased, an enslaved woman's journey did not end, in many cases. It had only just begun. The Ottoman system treated training as an investment, a way to increase a captive's market value or ensure she served her master's household with maximum efficiency. The compounds where this took place were carefully organized. Dormitories held hundreds of women in neat rows, their sleeping mats aligned as precisely as soldiers' beds. Language instructors drilled them daily in Turkish, with advanced pupils learning Persian and Arabic for service in elite households. Music rooms echoed with the soft strum of the oud and the trill of flutes, as instructors taught songs and dances that would please Ottoman patrons. Household management was another cornerstone of training. Women were taught to manage kitchens, oversee servants, prepare elaborate banquets, and maintain the delicate etiquette of greeting and serving high-status guests. Those with needlework skills might be trained in embroidery for the palace, producing intricate silks for the sultan's robes. Others were schooled in storytelling, poetry recitation, or chess pursuits that could elevate them from a laborer to a companion. The supply chain for these women stretched across continents. Caravans wound through the Caucasus, their cargo hidden under cloth tarps. Slave ships crossed the Black Sea, docking in the bustling harbors of Constantinople where buyers waited. From the southern Mediterranean came African women, brought by traders from Tripoli, Tunis, and Alexandria. Each route was guarded by a network of brokers, escorts, and officials who ensured the steady flow of human beings into the city's markets. Yet legally, these women were property. The Ottoman law code spelled out their rights and obligations, though rights meant little more than the master's duty to provide food and shelter. A child born to an enslaved mother inherited her status automatically, cementing a generational cycle of bondage. Conversion to Islam was often enforced, severing religious ties as effectively as the loss of family and homeland. Economically, the system was indispensable to the empire. Slave trading enriched merchants, paid taxes into the imperial treasury, and supported entire industries from shipbuilding to textile production. Whenever European diplomats urged abolition, Ottoman officials countered that ending the trade would cripple the economy. In reality, the system did more than sustain the empire's wealth. It reshaped its society, embedding slavery into the very architecture of Ottoman life. From the humblest merchant's home to the sultan's harem, the presence of enslaved women was not unusual, it was expected. For all the meticulous record-keeping that defined the Ottoman slave system, one detail stands out in its absence: the missing generations that should have existed, by every calculation. The sheer number of enslaved women in Constantinople should have produced a large population of mixed-heritage children over the centuries. Yet, the imperial censuses show almost none. The 1612 Ottoman census listed some 300,000 enslaved women in the capital, alongside roughly 200,000 free Ottoman men of reproductive age. Demographics alone make the absence of a significant mixed population statistically impossible unless deliberate measures were taken to prevent it. Hints of these measures surface in the testimony of outsiders. Maria, a Greek midwife who worked in the city for over 2 decades, gave a sworn account to Venetian officials after returning home. She spoke of being summoned to elite households where pregnancies among enslaved women were managed in ways that left no child to raise. Her words were careful, but the meaning was clear: births that would have complicated the boundaries between free and enslaved. Muslim and non-Muslim were quietly erased. Archaeology lends weight to these accounts. Excavations at the site of the former Haseki Sultan complex revealed burial grounds where the remains skewed heavily toward young women and infants, far more than would be expected from disease or normal mortality. Some graves were unmarked, others so shallow that bones had shifted with the seasons. The practice was not left to chance. Palace budgets from 1634 include line items for household management and demographic control, a chillingly vague phrase that appears alongside expenditures for food, clothing, and medical supplies. Legal rulings offered cover for such acts, citing the preservation of clear lineage as essential to social stability. To the outside world, the Ottomans denied everything. When European envoys raised the question, officials blamed the absence of mixed populations on high infant mortality. Yet the selectivity of that mortality affecting enslaved women's children almost exclusively betrayed the truth. For the women living under this threat, every pregnancy was shadowed by fear. Some sought to avoid conception altogether. Others endured the loss in silence, forbidden even to speak of the child they had carried. Trauma left its mark not only on their bodies, but on the culture of the enslaved, where hope for the future was tempered by the knowledge that it might never be allowed to live. The missing names in the records, the missing faces in the streets, were not an accident of history. They were the deliberate outcome of a system that treated human life as a resource to be controlled and erased. When it no longer served the empire's design, some parents, knowing what awaited their sons if taken by the Devshirme, chose an act so desperate it still echoes in folk memory. They harmed their children to save them. The most infamous case came in 1689 in the Bulgarian village of Köçek. Word had spread that Ottoman collectors would arrive within the month. The elders met in secret, weighing an impossible choice. By the time the decision was made, the outcome was grimly organized. Over 3 nights, parents maimed their sons in ways designed to make them unfit for selection. By the time the officials arrived, 89 of the village's 92 eligible boys limped, squinted, or bore fresh wounds that would never heal cleanly. The records of Father Dimitri, a local priest, preserve one of these confessions. In 1654, he had partially blinded his 8-year-old son, Georgie. I harmed my beautiful boy to save him from a worse fate. He wrote, "His cries haunt me, but I pray God will forgive what love made necessary. Better my son live with disability than die in Turkish service." Such acts were not isolated in Bosnia. A 1697 Ottoman report complained bitterly of damaged goods in village after village boys with suspiciously similar injuries. Entire communities where the youth were marked like diseased cattle. Officials suspected coordination, and they were right. Families developed methods to produce disabilities that would appear permanent but cause minimal lasting harm, poorly set fractures, burns that scarred the skin, partial deafness caused by damaged eardrums. The toll was more than physical. Imagine standing before your child, knowing that in hours his perfect face or steady gait would be gone by your own hand. Some parents could not do it themselves, begging neighbors to wield the blade or the stick. Folk songs remember these moments in verses so raw they seem to tremble a mother holding her son's head as the blow falls, singing to drown his screams. Archaeological studies in former collection zones show the legacy of these acts. Skeletal remains reveal patterns of childhood injury too consistent to be accidental, healed breaks in the same bones, facial fractures in the same places, digits missing in similar ways. The bones speak of a grim knowledge passed down how to wound without killing, how to save by disfiguring. But even this desperate strategy carried risks. In some cases, the Ottomans took disabled boys anyway, both to fill quotas and to punish defiance. In 1702, Serbia. 23 such boys were seized, their impairments ignored. For the empire, they were examples proof that no amount of resistance could stop the Sultan's will. Marko Dimitrev's name still rests in the Ottoman archives, ink faded but legible, row 17 of the 1515 Köprüstit collection. The record notes his age, his father's trade, and a final annotation, renamed Yusuf. It says nothing of his mother's cries, nothing of the frozen road that took him from his village, nothing of the 40 years he would serve in the palace before dying alone, never knowing whether his family had survived. His story was not unique. It was multiplied by hundreds of thousands over 6 centuries, each boy a life uprooted, reshaped, and put to use in a system that saw human beings as resources to be managed like grain, taxes, or military supplies. The bureaucrats who wrote his name in their ledgers may have gone home that evening to their own children, kissed them good night, and thought themselves good men. This is the true horror of the Devshirme, not only its scale or its cruelty, but its normality. It was state policy, refined over generations, embedded in the empire's legal codes, religious justifications, and economic planning. It was an industry in which record keepers, guards, trainers, merchants, and nobles all played their part without question. The leather-bound ledgers that drove this machine still sit in Istanbul's archives, each line an artifact of loss. In their cold, neat script lies the history the empire preferred not to tell, a record not of progress or civilization, but of the industrialization of exploitation. We tell ourselves that such things belong to the past, yet the patterns endure today. Millions are trafficked and enslaved across the world, their names logged in spreadsheets instead of parchment, their fates determined by quotas and profits rather than imperial decree. The tools have changed, the logic has not. History's most unsettling lesson is this: extraordinary evil rarely appears monstrous in the moment. It is carried out by ordinary people following orders, filing reports, meeting targets. And unless we remember how easily human lives can be reduced to numbers in a ledger, we will not see the danger when it comes again.